Save your strength, save your strength. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. What I thought I might do for today's session, just give you a little bit of background of myself, our national headquarters, the history of SVA, and then I kind of wanted to pulse the room, know what questions kind of exist, and then I'll spend the remainder of our time taking a deep dive on any questions that you might have. In addition, joining me from our national headquarters staff is Jensen. So I'd like to introduce my favorite Marine over here. So now I was Navy, as you might know, and my jobs in the Navy, I was a submariner primarily. I was also a diver on submarines. And what I often like to say to our Marine sister and brethren is the best Marine is a submarine. So so just teasing. But Calvin actually lives here local. So we have two of our headquarters staff members that are not based in Washington, D.C. Calvin and his girlfriend just moved here. She's a doctor of pharmacy, and she now moved to the area, so they've been relocated. So we actually have now a really valuable resource from our headquarters staff right here in the state of North Carolina. So by the end of today, we'll make sure everyone gets linked up with Calvin's contact information as well as our national headquarters contact information. Should anyone need anything, you've actually got one of only two state-level resources in all of SVA. So just really quickly, briefly on myself, I grew up in Massachusetts. I came to Florida my senior year in high school, so that's always a lovely transition. And then I enlisted in the world's finest Navy on August 5th, 2001. So my timing was impeccable. I joined the peacetime military, and while I was in basic training in Great Lakes, Illinois, September 11th occurred. It not only changed the course of history for myself, but for millions in my generation of post-9/11 veterans. And what I do not share in many of our generations, such as Calvin and I'm sure many in the room, is I joined a peacetime military. I did not join a military during a time of war. That decision was made beyond my control. So I have the utmost respect for any generation of veterans, myself and those that have come before us, or who have ever entered in service, whether drafted or volunteered during a time of war, because I think it's something very special about America, but interestingly not unique. So it's been every time in our nation's history that she's needed her sons and daughters, they've always answered the call. And that's something that is very cool about America, and I think differentiates us from the rest of the world. So just to talk a little bit about the history of SVA, because I think it's relevant to how we've shaped ourselves to support veterans in higher education, as well as our family members and allies. So Student Veterans of America was founded in 2008, but the real story of SVA starts a couple years before that. In 2006, we had student veterans returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan, just like myself, and they were coming back to college and university campuses. Did anyone in the room use the Montgomery GI Bill? I wound up using it, yeah, so we're dating ourselves. Now, here's what's interesting. I know that not many hands went up to use the Montgomery GI Bill. How many people paid in $100 to use it? Yeah, more than used it, right? So do you know that this is the first time in the history of the GI Bill, in 75 years, we have two GI Bills. So the Montgomery GI Bill still exists, and still today, service members that are on active duty are signing up and paying $100 at boot camp. I was just with the National Educator Tour down at Fort Benning. So for our Army folks in the room, I got to play Army for nearly a week with high school guidance counselors, high school superintendents, and college and university presidents for the Army's National Educator Tour. And had the chance to actually talk with troops who were in boot camp. And you know, you'd be surprised at how many of them are still paying $100 a month. It's nearly 70% of the active duty force is still putting in $100 a month. You want to talk about a true tax on troops, right? And we're charging $100 to our lowest enlisted, our lowest earners in the whole military, and they don't have to. So we're actually, as one of our national priorities, we're trying to close the Montgomery GI Bill such that we only have one GI Bill, because you don't have to pay the $100. And again, more hands went up than have used it. I exhausted the whole Montgomery GI Bill for its 36 months, but because I was eligible for the post-9/11 as well, I had 12 additional months. Thank you, Uncle Sam, for grad school. I really appreciate that. So when you look at this, though, back 2006, these student veterans, they're using the GI Bill. It's pretty awesome. They like it. They're going back to school, as so many of us have before. But they realized that the original GI Bill was a lot more robust back in 1944. It did things like pay the university your tuition directly. It provided a living stipend, a book stipend. It had special provisions if you were focusing on something that at the time we called vital to national security, things like science, technology, engineering, math, etc. And so they're looking back on this and they're thinking to themselves, gee, this Montgomery GI Bill is great, but it's not nearly as comprehensive. Additionally, if you might note, the Montgomery GI Bill was actually created as a peacetime benefit, right? So the GI Bill had always been associated with war, right? We'd have a war, we'd start a new GI Bill. So the World War II era of veteran, once they exhausted it, we had Korea come right after. They had to make a new GI Bill for them. Once Vietnam came after, there wasn't very good of a GI Bill for our sisters and brothers that served in Vietnam. My father-in-law is an infantry Marine from Vietnam. I always tease him that the best gift I've ever received in my life was from a Marine. That's my wife. But that to say, when they came home, Congress wasn't sure that they wanted to pass a new GI Bill because their war wasn't over. And at the time, it was the longest period of sustained combat in our nation's history. Now, Afghanistan holds that distinction. But at the time, we weren't sure, so we didn't have as robust a GI Bill after Vietnam. And so many in Congress, actually many Vietnam veterans, thought when they were in Congress in the 80s, man, we've got to do something about this, because if in an all-volunteer force we have the potential of our wars being longer, there's going to be generations who come home and get out and have to wait for a GI Bill. That doesn't make any sense. So Sonny Montgomery, who was a World War II veteran, a Korea veteran, and a Vietnam veteran, retired, I think, as a two-star general in Mississippi. Of the GI Bill's distinction, Montgomery GI Bill is named after him. They created this peacetime war benefit for veterans, kind of simultaneously linking the notion that if you serve your country, you have the opportunity for an education. All that to say, this generation, post 9/11 in 2006, they're looking back at it all and going, maybe we could do better. Our three founding chapters are the University of Wisconsin, the University of Michigan, and Columbia University in New York. That seems a bit disparate for the ability to actually link up to one another. Well, I have something that's both fun and maybe a little embarrassing to admit, but our organization, Student Veterans of America, holds a unique distinction from other veteran organizations in that we were the first veteran organization that was not founded by getting together in person. You think about the stories of the VFW or the American Legion, both now over 100 years old. They got together because they had to. Ours was a generation who had the advent of social media. So we were actually founded on MySpace. I continue to maintain that we are the best thing to have ever come out of MySpace. But anyone in the room still friends with Tom? But actually we started to talk to one another in chat rooms and via social media, and then moving those on to conference calls, lengthy conference calls in the early days, but talking about how there might be this new idea of a GI Bill. And we realized that we were not original thinkers. There was a couple of US senators at the time by the name of Jim Webb and Chuck Hagel, both of them Vietnam veterans themselves, one an officer, one enlisted, who were trying to have a new GI Bill. And it wasn't, it's this notion always that veteran legislation is just blanketly go America and it just sails through Congress. It's just simply not true. We have limited resources as a government, and we have to be careful as to how we spend them, and there's competing interests for so many different things, right? All that to say, there was major resistance to the idea of a new GI Bill for this generation. The primary resistance at the time was from the Bush administration and the late Senator McCain. And the theory at the time went that, if we make a new GI Bill with an all-volunteer force, fighting a war on two fronts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and globally deployed all over supporting the global war on terrorism, if we make the GI Bill too good, everyone's going to get out. Who's going to fight the war, right? That was a really short-sighted notion at the time. But it was Student Veterans of America, along with many other advocacy organizations, that started this grassroots movement where we started to mobilize student veterans from throughout the country to meet with their members of Congress in key congressional districts back home where they serve, where they vote, and have the conversation with them that, hey, this is how the GI Bill is going to impact me and my family. And we showed the real stories, the human side of what this notion was, and we made it less of an ethereal concept and more of a true concept. That led to ultimately the White House coming aboard with the idea. Senator McCain ultimately supported it, and in the final hours in 2008, the post 9/11 GI Bill became real. All that to say, this is 2008, we had been grassroots advocating for about 2 years. Our founders hosted the first ever SVA NatCon. We call this the SVA National Conference. We've done 11 of them to date. So back at the first one in the snowy suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, we decided, okay, great, this legislation is moving forward, but what are we going to do? Like, are we sticking around? Are we going to do this before? So again, history. So there has been, in history, including SVA, 3 national organizations of student veteran organizations. The first one was after World War II, and it lasted about 7 years and then dissolved. The second one was actually after Vietnam. It was called the Collegiate Veterans of America, CVA. And they, again, lasted about 7 years and then dissolved. So we were looking at this going like, well, why did they dissolve? Is there a need for this? You know, we were a young, new generation of veterans, and do we need this? We ultimately determined that the majority of veterans are actually transitioning through post-secondary education. And when they do, there is a lot of myth and misconception about what we need. So here's what the aggregated national data tells us that we need. First is access to childcare. Second is course sequencing. And third is actually a connection to a community. And so if you think about it at its heart, that's what an SVA chapter is, a connection to your community, a leaping off point from the military to your new existence as a student, and then on to a successful civilian life. And so from that standpoint, our founders said yes. And we decided to unite under one banner, and 23 individual student organizations came together. They elected the name Student Veterans of America. And from those early and humble beginnings, we've grown from 23 chapters in 14 states to now 1,500 plus chapters in all 50 American states and US territories and 4 countries overseas. Where there is an SVA chapter at present, there's just over 750,000 student veterans currently going to school. And so what we do now is we focus on actually supporting our chapter leaders. So we consider them the force multipliers to create community on their campus and be the change for positive good for veterans, military family members, and allies. And so what our national headquarters is structured to do is kind of 3 key components. And it follows the journey line of the student veteran for what we call to, through, and beyond higher education. 2 is transition from the military. There are not many focused on the transition. Does anyone go through TAP or ACAP or any of the different things we talked about? And it was the best thing ever, right? It was totally comprehensive, took care of it. I'm a little facetious there, but the notion is there are not many advocates actually making the case that it should be made better. And if you think about veteran advocacy organizations, the average age for most veteran advocacy organizations of their members is 58 years old, right? They've been out of the military a great long time. And so they're not focused on the issues of the newest transitioning generation every time they transition. So we fill a need in that regard, and that leads to some of our advocacy work. And it's trying to make sure that the majority of veterans that transition through higher education wind up at the right schools and the right majors for them. What we know right now is that on average, veterans change our majors, and I was in this category as well, on average 2.6 times, compared to civilians who have never served in the military that only changed their majors 1.7 times. Now, why is this? Well, I have theories. I don't have good data on this, but our theory is that if you look at veterans, the majority of us are just like me, first members of our family to ever go to college. And if you think about how many people choose college, the first way is through high school guidance counselors, and the second is through family affinity structures. Well, it's a little bit awkward at 27, 28 to go back to your high school guidance counselor and say, yo, remember me? Right? The second element is it's kind of challenging to go to your family and say, hey, how do I do this college thing if no one in your family that you know has gone to college? And so the majority of us as veterans, we do college OJT, right, on the job. We figure it out as we go. And many of us start in majors that many students do. The most common ones we start in are history, criminal justice, political science, English, and kinesiology. But we graduate in business, STEM, and health-related fields. So we're starting in fields that we think we want to explore, and then we're often getting our prerequisites done from our credits that do transfer, the ones that do, from the military, into our usually community college, and then we're taking care of all of our gen eds, and then we matriculate into a 4-year, and by the time we start taking courses for our real major, we go, crap, I gotta get a job after this, and not a lot of jobs for history majors, no offense that I'm a social science guy, and then so we start looking at other options, and we start changing as we go. So what we do look at is last year, nearly $12 billion was spent on the GI Bill. $12 billion. Our government didn't spend $1 on academic advisement for anyone that used that money. That's bullshit, right? And so if we start, sorry to curse, I'm a recovering sailor. So what we're looking at is how can we better leverage that amazing federal benefit to ensure that we're getting education benefit, because the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Education, Department of Labor, and the Small Business Administration, who all own the elements of transition, their biggest priority is to lower unemployment compensation claims that are filed. They're worried about paying unemployment compensation more than they are making a successful transition. And so what we'd like to see is better government resources being put towards ensuring that we have the ability to get good academic advisement and guidance counseling on our way out of the military towards not only our academic futures, but also our careers. Because what we also know is that 50% of veterans in college work full-time while they're in school. Another 25% of us are working part-time. Now, senior members of the government will look at it and say, well, gee, I wish I had the GI Bill when I went back to school. Why are they all working? Well, stand by. 75 years ago, the GI Bill was designed for a 22-year-old single person with no dependents, and we never changed it. The average student veteran that is in school is between the ages of 24 and 38. They're working full or part-time while they're in school. 52% of us are married with children, 19% are single parents. We're grown-ups when we go back to school, right? The GI Bill is generous, nobody would deny that. But it's designed for a 22-year-old single person with no dependents. And so we have to work and put food on the table for our families while we're going to school. And so we're working. And on average, we're taking 15 credit hours, maintaining a 3.35 GPA, and graduating at higher rates than anyone else in college. We, today's student veterans, are the tip of the spear for the wave that is coming of non-traditional students, those Americans that have been left out of post-secondary education. And the funny thing is, if you look at the struggles that they had, I told you earlier that the biggest issues for veterans in college, childcare, course sequencing, and connection to community. The only thing to add for all non-traditional students is access to financing, right? And that's the #1 issue for adult learners in America, and then the rest follow the same for veterans. We have the great benefit of having a GI Bill. So how can we, as institutions of higher learning, as student veteran organizations, and the government and the private sector, leverage that $12 billion a year investment in our educations to try to open up, like the original GI Bill, education opportunities for all Americans that have been left out of it, right? So that's the to portion. The through, that's really, honestly, we look like a student organization on a campus, and if we're thriving, we look like just like everyone else on campus. There's this notion in higher education of veteran-friendly or military-friendly or best for vets, right? These are marketing ploys to put in a magazine that, through our research, we've been able to demonstrate no transitioning service member reads. So we don't know why we keep doing it, right? Also, what does friendly mean? Now, if you know what it means on your campus, I encourage you to keep doing it. But if you don't know what it means, and if it's just to be on a list, stop doing it. We shouldn't do anything that we don't know what it means. Further, the terminology that we use matters because, honestly, we've learned words matter, right? And the words that we use are super important. So think about other minority groups in a college environment. Are any of them friendly? Are we women friendly? Are we disabilities friendly? Are we minorities? No, we're inclusive. And so the goal in higher education shouldn't be friendly for veterans and military-connected students and our families. It should be student-veteran inclusive. Because when we show up with the intent to try to make sure that all of us can bring our full selves to our education experience, that's really important. And further, what student veterans through our annual surveys have told us is we don't want to be, it's nails on a chalkboard every time I hear a veteran student. A veteran student is a Tommy Boy or a Van Wilder of sorts who has been trying to work on their undergraduate for the last 40 years. That's a veteran student. A student veteran is somebody who has worn the cloth of their nation and has now come back to reintegrate into society and their campus community to be fully included in that campus environment as a student first. Do you know, really interesting research, do you know what veterans don't consider ourselves in the first 5 years of separating from active duty? Veterans. Isn't that weird, right? That's not because we're not proud of our service. We most assuredly are, right? We got a lot of stuff to get going in our lives, right? We don't come to college to be a veteran. We come to college to be a student, to earn an education, and then go on and live a successful life. Interestingly, most people join civic organizations in the United States at the age of 58. Do you know that most people join veteran organizations at the age of 58? So anytime an old school veteran organization tells you that their generations are, no one's joining, that's fine. They never have, right? Like literally from the beginning, we always join later in life. When we have time, we don't join the Kiwanis clubs or the Lions club until later in life. That's just how it works. When the kids have moved out, we're further enough along in our careers. If we take a couple of days off to do volunteering and things we can, and we have disposable income. That's when we join organizations. So Student Veterans of America is not in the business of trying to produce lifetime members, right? What we're trying to do is produce college graduates that go on to lead successful lives by connecting them to their communities and ensuring that advocacy at the campus and local community levels are as inclusive as possible. You know, one of the things that I didn't cover this morning, and I'm remiss, is the sheer number of student veterans that are women. So let's take just a quick look when we talk about inclusivity. So all veterans living, only about 11% are women, our sisters in arms. Then if you look at the active duty force, it's about 17–18% women and growing. It's the quickest growing demographic in the US military, especially now that all jobs are open to women as well. But if you look at student veterans, fully 27% of all student veterans are women veterans. And 47% of our SVA chapters nationwide and around the world are actually women. So we have more women leadership than any other national veteran organization in the country. Because our sisters in arms feel included, we hope. That is what we're trying to drive at. And if they don't, we're striving to make that better every single day. And so inclusivity matters in our chapters, it matters on our campuses, it matters in our communities, and frankly, it's important for our country. And look, companies across America now have departments called diversity and inclusion intentionally to ensure that every member of their workforce shows up as their full self so that they can adequately contribute and make what they do better. It should be the same on college and university campuses, and definitely the same in our chapters. So on campus, it's about community and campus-level advocacy. And then the beyond, when we transition into our careers, it's ensuring that companies know that the generation of veterans today are actually extremely educated. So we've all heard about hiring initiatives over the past 15 years. We've got 100,000 veterans, a bazillion veterans. I'm gonna hire every veteran in the world, right? Well, it doesn't really add up because the majority of veterans that are alive right now are actually of the World War II, Korea, and Vietnam era and are not in the workforce as much as the ones that are younger. It's about to tip the scales to a workforce generation being the majority. It just hasn't yet. So less than half, it takes that right out. But the majority of those companies, when you look at the jobs that they're hiring for jobs that don't require education. And so that's misaligned with the fact that 77% of the post-9/11 era that are actively seeking employment either have education or are already finishing it. So when you look fully at who's transitioning, you're talking about nearly 70% of the active duty force is in a college classroom within 7 months of getting off of active duty. So people go, okay, well, I'm worried about the other 30%. Well, just about 20% of that active duty force, about 21%, actually already has their education. 100% of our officer corps, and then about 15% the enlisted force separate with a degree. So if we say college isn't for everybody, for the transitioning generation of veteran, I'm not talking about all generations, just the transitioning, that's true, but it's only true for 9% of us. So if that's the case, we need to make sure that companies understand that when they're hiring veterans, they don't under-hire us when they see veteran on the resume. The goal shouldn't be to look at what branch we were in, or how long we served, or what our rank was when we got out. The goal should be, did you serve? Yes or no? And then, are you educated? Yes or no? And then align the opportunities within that company accordingly. And so that's what we're working with companies, and that's why over 70 companies come to our national conference every year, is, yeah, they hire while they're there, but they're also there to meet with our chapter leaders, understand what's going on in their campuses, and better understand how they can integrate veterans into their workforce. So we think about it comprehensively, to, through, and beyond higher education. So with that said, that's just a little bit about the organization's programs and research efforts. The last thing is our advocacy. So we are the voice for veterans in higher education on Capitol Hill. We have not been able to build out a very effective state-level advocacy, so we focus in Congress. If you go to SVA's national headquarters, you're talking about 41 full-time people. That's it, supporting this whole national network. So we're a small team, but we're mighty. And the work that we do on Capitol Hill ensures, one, that the GI Bill is not only protected, but more accurately representative of this generation of veterans, right? So that's why the Forever GI Bill was a $3.45 billion enhancement, expansion, and improvement of the GI Bill, and not one single idea came from our headquarters staff in DC. It came from veterans all over the country by just listening and understanding what's going on. We took all of those provisions, over 30 of them, and packaged them up into a new piece of legislation that expanded, enhanced, and improved the GI Bill for a new generation of warriors. And we'll continue to do that. We removed the eliminating date because prior to the Forever GI Bill, you only had 15 years to use your GI Bill. Now let's say that you separated from active duty, you went right to work to support your family, took a couple of classes here and there as you're slowly finishing your degree, but you're not done with it by 15 years, and let's say you have 20 months left. That was it was gone. Or let's say that you took no classes, you supported your family, and now you want to go back to school in your 40s because you want to advance in your career. Well, your GI Bill's gone, sorry. But it was an earned benefit, right? So it should be there. So now, every veteran that separates from active duty after January of 2013 has their entire lifetime to use the GI Bill. That's where it got its moniker forever. It's good forever. Further, there was provisions for Purple Heart recipients. So if you earned a Purple Heart but didn't serve 36 months of active duty, either because you were brand new in the military or you were serving in a Guard Reserve unit and didn't have active duty time and then were medically retired as a result, you got half your GI Bill. That was a real thing. It impacted over 4,000 Purple Heart recipients. So we fixed that. And there was tons of other fixes that we did. Now implementation is a bear. It is. Anytime you put into effect a new law, you gotta get it through Congress. And then once the law exists, you gotta get it implemented through the bureaucracy that is the VA. Now, we could all beat up the VA if we want. They're trying, they really are. Biggest challenge that they have is the ability to actually communicate. So the VA actually couldn't send an email to every GI Bill user, school certifying official, and college and university campus if they wanted to. They don't have it in the database. So what we're trying to do is get the VA the authority to move over to the VHA and to have, when you are doing your certificate of eligibility, the requirement, even though the law says you have to, if you just type a space bar, you don't have to enter your email address or your contact information. It's technically entered. And so there's literally almost half of everybody, they can't even send an email if they want. So we want them to be able to so that they can communicate with all of us actively. So if you are somebody receiving those contacts, often by snail mail, sometimes by email from the VA, please share it with your sisters and brothers in arms because there's a very possibility that they're not getting it. If you run a local Facebook group for your chapter or you've got a listserv, whether because you're a school certifying official or you've maintained your own as a club, please, when those communications are coming out, help the VA out by disseminating them because very often they're just not making it to us that are using our GI Bill. So, but that's basically a little nutshell of SVA. But what I'd really like to do is kind of hear from the room. I mean, what are some things that you've got just as questions on your mind or things that you might like to know more about that Calvin and I can do a better deep dive for, whether we're talking student issues right on your campus, issues with the administration, or just stuff that's going on at the federal level. I'd like to pulse the room. So who's got our first question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that top priority for SVA is child care.
Sure.
Students get child care. I work at a small campus. We don't have a child care facility on campus.
Got it.
I don't know what we could do to help with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So, you know, the first instinct that you have, I think, is solid. If you've got an on-campus facility, well, fantastic, utilize that. Many on-campus facilities do exist, but they're primarily there for faculty, staff, and graduate level students, because most schools don't think of undergrads as having kids, right? We're non-traditional students, so as undergrads we probably do. So ensure that you've got like an inclusive policy as it pertains to something that already exists on campus. If not, believe it or not, there are many community organizations that are providing childcare at either low or reduced costs. What we find with veterans is that we're not always after everything for free, right? Although, and I live my life, if it's free, it's for me, but you know, often what we're looking for is something that's reasonable. And the challenge is that childcare is incredibly expensive, and if you're trying to go to school full-time and work full-time, you're usually working a job that is not totally in line with your degree, because the goal is to have a job that's somewhat supportive of your academic requirements as well. But also, too, thinking through the experience of a student and when they need childcare. What they're often not saying is, I need childcare Monday through Friday for my, I've got that under control. What I need it for is when I have a morning class before the daycare opens. Or what I need it for is during midterms or finals when I need to actually study on campus and I can't get a sitter or I can't find those types of things. So actually, some of the things that we found really successful is student veteran organizations on campuses themselves actually putting together sitter groups just to, at the grassroots level, be able to provide some of that help. But I think that anyone that actually works at an institution of higher learning, if you start reaching out to your community organizations and figuring out what childcare options are available, you're going to be overwhelmed that they exist. It's sort of like when we all say, hey, there's all these veteran resources in our local communities, across our state and across our country, but no one knows how to find them, right? It's the same thing when it comes to those other parts of our lives. The issue is that most people don't associate veterans needing childcare. They assume it's behavioral and mental health, substance abuse, risk of homelessness, food insecurity. These are issues that impact our community, but they're pretty small, and it's actually a pretty huge issue to deal with childcare, but nobody's trying to solve the problem. So local level, banding together, providing it ourselves. At the institution level, look in those local communities for what resources already exist, and then bring them onto campus. Very often they probably are not partnered with your university, and that lets you bring something to bear not just likely for veterans, but for all non-traditional students that are on that campus that are suffering the same kind of woes as it pertains to childcare options. Additionally, from the club level, if you're looking to schedule events, make sure that you're always scheduling events that bode well for single people and for families, right? And you can have separate events, right? The happy hour that happens every other week, right? Or the first Tuesday of the month. Also think about family dinner nights. And if you've got tailgate options, making sure that they're family friendly. Hey, let's dial back the F-bombs, guys, which I struggle with terribly. But, you know, those kinds of things. Making sure that we're inclusive of everybody so that we're not just only appealing to the veteran that can, quote, show up to everything because they don't have other obligations. It's a great question. There was another one, blue shirt. That's a good color here in North Carolina.
Thank you. I think I went to the wrong place,
It's okay. I went to Florida State for my undergrad, so NC State just gets me every year in football. So I feel like I'm in tough territory.
So good. Hi, so my name is Javier. I'm actually transitioned from the military. I will retire in 1 year.
Congrats.
Thank you. I'm an SBA member. Recently graduated from UMUC.
Right on. University of Maryland, University College.
Ooh.
We're an acronym-heavy bunch, right? Always try to say what the acronyms mean.
So that's how teamwork works in the SBA, you know.
Boom.
So the point that I would like to bring, and I will certainly link up with your partner over here.
Calvin.
Yes, correct. I'm in Fort Bragg, and something that you look at is the leadership of soldiers transitioning out of the military and the support that they're supposed to provide these soldiers. And the reason why nowadays this room could be filled with a lot of transitioning service members, not just Army, but you know, soldiers are like in my boat, 1 year to get out to 6 months. There should be a whole lot of them here. At least I would like for it to be as such, because I think that builds a good base, if you will, for as they transition military become student better.
Sure thing.
As I said, plan to do. I was fortunate enough to be able to start this program 2 years ago based on good leadership that I had. Some rocky steps as I came closer, but again, something to look at is get involved with those higher leaders. And also a recommendation I would put out, see if any way, shape, or form SBA could tap into Untitled Chapter. By the way, it's not ACAP anymore, so you all know it's still. And
Right.
it's actually gotten very good. I remember it got, I said 20 years. But see if, I think the data that it could be gathered from soldiers going through their program would help bring up the point that I'm bringing up.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about guys, you know, they're about to get out 2 months from now, and now they're assisting these programs. You know, it's a shame. And yes, the Army has the DoD has a lot of programs in place where you have to start, you know, with a certain time, and then commanders, you know, 6 months within they get out, the primary mission should be transitioning. But yeah, that's all nice because it reads well, but yeah, it doesn't really happen.
In practice, it's tough. Yeah, no.
I think that would make a huge difference if, you know, at the end that soldiers come in, and the same with TA, you know, but yeah, I'll give more.
No, I appreciate that. And just to give you some additional insights. So one of the measures that DoD has to note whether or not broadly transition and their programs they're in are successful is satisfaction surveys at the end. And the satisfaction surveys at the end rate very high. They're issued after you complete. They say, you know, was this valuable? Was it good? And we all, yep. And they go, hey, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines are telling us we kill it. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, if I go to a restaurant tomorrow night, have a lovely dinner, and afterwards the owner of the restaurant says, was that good? And I go, absolutely. And 4 hours later, I have food poisoning. What does it matter if my survey result was this was great right afterwards, but I did something bad later, right? So I don't know that that's the right measure, right? An additional internal measure to the DoD is how many service members are filing unemployment claims, right? And I also don't know that that's the most accurate measure to determine whether or not we're successful. Now, to your earlier point, it has gotten a lot better. I agree with that. One of the things that's really interesting is now tracks are provided, right? So you can choose whether employment track, entrepreneurship track, education track, what I call the stay-in track, right? I'm leaving active duty, I might choose the guard or reserve to, quote, stay in, right? The utilization of those tracks for the past 6 years has been under 15% because most of us, if we think about when we're getting out, it's the hierarchy of needs. Well, I need to get out and replace that income because the vast majority of the military does not retire, right? We separate, we have no health care, we have no pension, we're getting out, I gotta pay the bills and replace my income, then I'm probably gonna go to school, and then I'm gonna look for a career after school. So we've misunderstood what the transition looks like for the most. So part of SVA's advocacy mission, we brief the Secretary of Defense quarterly along with a slew of other veteran service organizations like the VFW, the American Legion, and others. And during those meetings over the better part of the last 6 years, every quarter, often the chairman or the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs is with us as well. It's a day-long briefing. We hear what the DoD is doing, and we have the chance to express what our organizations are doing and what our priorities. And the outgoing vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is an awesome 4-star, cool, flat top in the Air Force by the name of General Selva. And Selva, broadly as a vice chair, you wind up being in charge of personnel readiness, training, those types of things. So transition would fall under him too. And he makes a really great point that, the military puts a lot of emphasis on retention, right? We all remember that from when we were in. Retention is king. Do you know, now the retention rate is ultimately measured by retirement. And a military retirement could be defined as you serve your full 20 and get out, or you do a medical retirement, which could be less than 20, right? Those are the two. When you roll those up, does anyone have any guess the percentage of people that ever reach a military retirement? It's 17%. So by that measure, we're not great at retaining the force, right? Most people are getting out. Right. And when they do get out, they're getting out without any of the benefits of a retirement, which is how the Department of Veterans Affairs is supposed to link in. So I think you've got a great point from a leadership perspective. That's important. I think also we own some responsibility to our own transition as well. But I think that we could better inform the process as to what the majority of the transitioning force ultimately winds up doing so that we come up with new benchmarks to measure whether it's successful. And I don't think those measurements should be, well, my survey, this was great, or my unemployment compensation was never filed, right? That's probably not the best measure of success, but I think it's a great point. Thank you. Yes, sir. Awesome beard, by the way. Serious beard envy up here.
So you mentioned the primary concerns of student veterans, and
yes,
it strikes me that those align rather acutely with graduate student concerns.
Hey, you're right.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, is there successful partnerships between student veteran organizations working with undergraduates in that regard, and then existing graduate student bodies?
I love the question, and so here's the thing that I always like to make abundantly clear about an SVA chapter. An SVA chapter chooses to affiliate with the national organization, right? So we're an affiliate-based organization. Our members of the chapters and the student veterans, they're on their campus. Which means that we put out leading and best practices and try to advise our chapters as to what to do. Because what we realized very early on is that culture is king, right? And every campus is a little bit different. Maybe you're a commuter school, maybe you're a very traditional school where people live closer to campus, or even in fact maybe on campus, graduate housing or undergraduate housing, etc. And so the thing that we drive in all of our chapter leader training is first and foremost to understand your campus culture as most acutely as you can. So, what is the overall student body population? What is the breakdown between undergraduates, transfer students, graduate students, male-female ratios, diversity and inclusion ratios? You look at all of it. What is the faculty to staff ratio? All of these types of things. Because things on your campus matter. Now, what I can tell you is that some SVA chapters have two chapters. They have an undergraduate chapter and a graduate chapter. And some graduate chapters are broken up in the business school, the law school, the medical school, and they're kind of like either their own student veteran organization or they're somehow broadly tied in. Other campuses, though, make no delineation between undergrad and graduate. They say, are you a student veteran, yes or no? You're all welcome. Some chapters actually don't even have requirements beyond the president and the vice president that you have to be a veteran to serve in an officer position in the club. Because if we talk about inclusivity, we can't put a sign on the door that says no civilians allowed, right? We want to be inclusive of everybody. Also, too, military dependents don't often, or family members, as I know they prefer to be called, don't often necessarily identify as, quote, a veteran, but many of them feel more akin to our veteran community. Some of them grew up in the Army, right? They spent 20 years moving with mom or dad around the country, and they more closely associate with the veteran community, so including them as well. But more direct to your point about whether there's some differences or not, you're absolutely right, first off, graduate student, right? Because graduate students tend to be older, right? And I think one of the things that we neglect to do when we look at veteran-related policy is we think of veteran as this like magical term that, you know, a veteran is all-encompassing and all-inclusive. Well, if anyone's majoring in marketing, we know that you have to determine your market and then like understand your audience. And so if we say all veterans living, we're literally talking about people who live in the United States between the ages of 18 and 112 years old. Basically, if we serve everyone, we serve no one, right? And so I think looking at some of the generational type things, the age of the population drives a lot more of their hierarchy and needs than purely veteran status, if that helps to make sense. So on the undergraduate level, you might have somebody who's 68 years old and is an undergraduate, right? They might find themselves much more relating to their professors than they might the other students around them, or perhaps the graduate students that exist. So I think driving towards the notion, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, of veteran inclusivity, and we start driving towards the inclusive notion, we can start removing those signs that say no one's allowed and sort of creating an environment where there's no wrong door to be able to come in and find community. And so I think looking at like from the community element, not probably from a policy perspective, but the community element of graduate students and undergraduate students, looking for more ways to connect with one another than, you know, massive differences as it pertains to our academic journeys, and realizing that we're probably all closer in age to each other than we realize. So yes, our academic requirements are different, but our social requirements usually are not all that different. And honing in on those, I think, can help towards inclusivity. Awesome beard again. I'm so jealous of that. Was that a hand? Just a little hair fix? Hair looks great, by the way. Yes, brother.
Because you helped with the Forever GI Bill, I'm just going to ask you for
Please.
instead of keep asking the VA. When will the schools get to, besides August 1st, 2019, when will we know more about the STEM scholarship?
Yeah.
And because I have students who are thinking like, okay, we don't know anything about it yet. Am I going to get it? I know that there's priority for certain people, and they're thinking about taking the fall off, but then how do they support themselves?
So yeah, it's one, a very good question. Two, what he's talking about is the Edith Norris Rogers STEM Extension Act, Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math STEM Extension Act, which is a provision of the Forever GI Bill that encompasses nearly $1 billion of that $3.45 billion that was changed. So it's the largest financial portion of it. Yeah, August for you know the August date, right?
Well, in the VA website, all it says is click here on August 1st.
Yeah. So I have the vantage point of being somebody who works with students every day, not the government, right? So we try to hold the government accountable, so I want to say that first. Secondly, I also have the ability to say whatever the hell I want, right? So I'm going to. It's a problem. So when you pass a law, there's the intent of the law, which then whoever has to implement the law has to interpret that intent. The VA has interpreted that intent that you had to be over 125 credits to be eligible for the STEM Extension Act. It's not really what the intent was. It was that you might not have enough GI Bill left to complete those credits. So the VA is interpreting the law differently than the Congress actually passed the law, and that's a problem. And so even if that August 1st date comes to bear, which if anyone saw how implementation went with like where your geographic location is, did anyone experience GI Bill payment delays, right? Like those are those unintended consequences of passing a law, so they're not ready. But I think what's even more frustrating over at VA is the GI Bill is administered by the Benefits Administration, which primarily considers the GI Bill kind of like disability and compensation. They don't consider it like an education benefit. So it's dollars in, dollars out, stop dates, like accountants would. And it's understandable. Their budget's about $100 billion, right? And only about 12 billion of that is like GI Bill, right? So it falls all the way down in the priority scale. And frankly, it's a very small staff. In all of VA's 240,000+ employees, we're talking about less than 1,700 deal with this. And a lot of this stuff is manually required to be processed. And they're understaffed, under-resourced, and frankly, I think that's a huge problem because when you would ask for information, you're told, click on a fucking website later. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear, but it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating. So I think even as a bigger philosophy, thinking maybe needs to change at the VA. So has anyone heard about the suicide rates that exist amongst veterans? Now we can talk about those, and I can wax poetic about the nuances of them, and I'm equipped to do that if anyone needs to talk about that. But VA often cites a statistic. Well, the majority of veterans that die by suicide are outside of the care of the VA. Well, who's the front door of the VA? The front door of the VA is the GI Bill, right? The majority of veterans that ever touch the VA at the beginning start with the GI Bill. And if we can't get it right there, how do veterans trust a system that is going to fail them later with their health, whether physical or mental or behavioral or cognitive, right? So we've got to start thinking of the GI Bill as a priority at the VA, right? It's thought of as an afterthought and just, they'll figure it out later. It's just free money for college. Well, that's BS, right? And it shouldn't be thought of that way, especially not when we start thinking about the shortage of engineers, scientists, mathematicians that our country faces a huge shortage of. Traditional age college students are not pursuing those degrees. Actually, the people that pursue it most are international students and student veterans. So why are we trying to make it harder for people to be able to finish? So it doesn't entirely answer your question, and it's me just rambling on about things that I'm pissed off about, so I'm sorry. But generally, they don't know the answer yet. And I do not have a whole lot of confidence that by August 1st they're going to have a good answer, and if they do, it's going to be that you're not eligible. So please tell the student veterans on your campus that, hey, sister, brother, I know that you're probably waiting, but if the difference is a student loan or finishing the GI Bill, and this breaks my heart to say, knowing what the intent of the law is, take out the student loan and finish and graduate and go earn a degree. Because this is probably going to be fixed years from now, not months. And it's probably not going to be super helpful to them. And I would hate to see one of them take a semester off, or even 2, that turns into 3, that turns into 4, and we are just waiting for the GI Bill to come around. And that's not an acceptable answer, and we're fighting every day to try to make that better. But it starts with culture, and I think the culture is a little bit damaged over there to think that the VA is suffering some different things, but then we look at the majority of transitioning service members, the first thing they use at the VA is the GI Bill, and we can't get that right. We're setting up a generation for failure, and we shouldn't be doing that. At least not given that we spend $240 billion on the department every year. It's probably not a great answer. I'm sorry for that.
Good enough. Thank you for the honesty.
So I'm getting the proverbial hook. My flight doesn't leave until tonight, so I'm sticking around. I know I probably didn't get to address every question in the room, but I'm not leaving until later this evening. So if anyone's got individual questions for me, by all means, feel free. But I don't want to keep you from your next session. Thank you all so much for being here. It matters a great deal that you're here. And thank you for what you do on your campus, whether serving veterans or serving your fellow brothers and sisters in arms. Appreciate it.